Okay, so I was asked to give an overview about the background to the new JORC Code, and I have done that in conjunction with some background on the ASX listing rules, because the two are very closely interrelated and were done in tandem as we went through the process. So we've just got a slide here which shows the previous version, the 2004 version of the JORC Code, as in comparison to the 2012 version, and I'll go into more detail about some of the reasons for the differences. So why was the JORC Code and the ASX listing rules updated? This allowed for several inclusion of several companies' updates that we had adopted since the 2004 version of the JORC Code. Effectively, as a hole was identified in the existing code, the gap was filled with an update in terms of the company's update on the ASX listing rules. So the sort of things that were introduced in that interim period were guidance on metal equivalents, on sampling, on inferred resource classification, in situ values, historical or foreign estimate guidance. And it really got to a point where we had a number of additional pieces of guidance that sat outside the JORC Code. ASIC was also very keen to introduce a rule to govern production target announcements. That was an area where there had been no prior guidance of any kind. They also wanted to include an annual review of mineral resources and ore reserves, which previously had not been in place. And there was also a need to bring most of the terms that we had within the JORC Code particularly in line with the CRISCO international reporting standards. There's still one or two differences, but in general the rewrite of the JORC Code has incorporated the CRISCO terms. We also wanted to reinforce the equal importance of the three major principles to the JORC Code, and that was materiality, transparency and competence. Under the 2004 JORC Code, what we had observed was that there was a lot of, maybe not a lot, but a number of announcements that were made where it was basically a case of trust me, I'm a competent person, but the attention to the materiality and indeed the transparency wasn't necessarily there for the investors to get a clear and balanced view of whatever the announcement was. Certainly one area that also needed improvement was transparency for reporting of exploration targets, and we'll learn more about that today. So really getting the understanding of what was behind, what was the supporting information behind an exploration target statement, and indeed what sort of target were we talking about, an aspirational target or a pre-resource target, where both ends of the spectrum are relevant. There was inclusion of a rule on extrapolation clarification for inferred resources. So for an inferred resource, if you've got a certain amount that's defined by extrapolation, there's now a requirement to actually define how much has been extrapolated as a proportion of the total of that inferred resource. We wanted also to introduce requirements for a minimum level of technical studies to support ore reserve statements. I guess a little later on we'll hear that although we're in a transition phase at the moment with mandatory reporting required under the new JORC Code and the new listing rules from December 1 this year, there is actually another 12 months grace period for the reporting of reserves to allow companies time to actually complete pre-feasibility studies. We also wanted to change, and this was particularly around making sure that there was more materiality and transparency with respect to announcements. We wanted to change the emphasis of Table 1 reporting from just material items to actually introducing an if not, why not system, so that every single item on Table 1 needs to be commented upon by the competent person, and if an issue is not material, the competent person actually needs to state that. So you can't just omit components of Table 1 in your supporting documentation. And then there were additional definitions around studies, for example. So we needed to define what a pre-feasibility study was, what a feasibility study was, and indeed what a scoping study was. Pre-fees and fees come straight out of CRISCO. We needed, for scoping study, to actually put a definition into the JORC Code. There also needed to be definitions around material or significant projects, because defining whether you have a material or a significant project actually allows you to consider whether you have a lot of additional disclosure that you need to make, depending on what the announcement is, and also the material change for an ore reserve or a mineral resource, or indeed a new resource or reserve. Taking those components into consideration helps you to identify where you do need to give additional disclosure on an announcement. So effectively, additional disclosure related to if you have a significant or a material project, and then you have either a new resource or new reserve, or indeed a material change to that resource or reserve will trigger additional disclosure. So the consultation process was actually was reasonably long, and in fact I joined the JORC committee very early in 2011, and the person that I replaced said, well, you know, it's not a lot of work, but almost immediately I joined, we went into the consultation process, and it was a lot of work. So early 2012 the review process commenced, and that required some feedback from industry on both listing rules and the JORC Code exposure documents. So both documents went out independently from JORC and ASX at that stage, and submissions were received. There were, and I'm sure many of you were present, there were a number of public meetings, there were a number of presentations, and indeed meetings with members of industry. Minerals Council of Australia had one large meeting for all members, and ultimately there were 114 written submissions obtained on the JORC exposure document, 138 obtained on the ASX exposure document. So that was over a 2-round period. There was then very, very solid liaison and cooperation between members of JORC, ASIC and ASX in terms of delivering both the listing rules draft and also the JORC Code draft. So those drafts were released in September of 2012. Additional comments, we had 81 additional written submissions received for the JORC Code, and I'm not sure of the exact number, but again, a number of written submissions received for the ASX listing rules. And based upon those submissions, they were relevant. They were taken into consideration in the final drafting of the ASX listing rules and the JORC Code. Obviously, there were a number of submissions that covered the same topic, so we rolled them up and incorporated them where it was feasible in the final version of both the listing rules and the JORC Code. So the listing rules, after receiving ultimately government approval, were released on the 8th of November 2012, and just a little over a month later the JORC 2012 code was released on December 20, just before Christmas. So as I said, there's a requirement. At the moment we're in a transition period, but from 1 December this year it will be mandatory to report under both the ASX listing rules and the JORC Code, where the listing rules are the overarching umbrella and the code sits underneath that. And as I also said, there's a 12-month grace period then additional to that for obtaining a pre-feasibility study to support an ore reserve statement. So what are the benefits of actually the updates to the listing rules and the JORC Code? Firstly, that we end up, or we intend as of 1 December to have ended up with acceptable and compatible both national and international public reporting standards. They'll provide greater confidence to investors and facilitate capital raising. So again, the transparency, the understanding of the investor as to what they're actually putting their money into. They'll encourage siphoning of scarce risk capital from non-mining sources. They'll facilitate investment comparisons between different mineral deposits and reduce unnecessary effort and costs for debt equity raising from different sources. And finally, they'll assist free flow of direct and portfolio investment, and therefore also reduce the cost of capital. And so now I'll hand over to Chris to take you through exactly what has changed.
Thank you very much, Jill. So really, I'll just provide a summary overview of what's changed. Then Graham and Matt will follow and go through some of the detail after Jackie's had a little discussion with you about competence. So what has changed in the new code? Big change is the Table 1 reporting on an if not, why not basis. It's stated in the principles, clauses 2 and 5, and then clauses 19, 27, and 35 pertain to the reporting of exploration results, mineral resources, or reserves, respectively. Competent person attributions in clause 9. There's been some changes there. The appendix includes a competent person's consent form. The competent person's consent is required for an exploration target now. So there's a number of changes in that area. It's a little bit simplified in that once exploration results, mineral resources, or reserves have been announced with a competent person consent, that it doesn't need on repeating that competent person's consent as long as certain conditions or the material assumptions haven't changed. Exploration targets in clause 17 is a new addition, as Jill had mentioned. Now there's a pre-feasibility study required for all reserves. Can't be just because you think it might be okay. Technical study definitions follow on from that. The annual reporting of resources and reserves has been fleshed out quite considerably. It was already in the code as clause 14. It's now expanded as clause 15, requiring that you do nominate a date, and every instance where you mention your resources or reserves have to refer to that particular reference date. We now have incorporated the company's updates in terms of metal equivalents and how metal equivalents are to be reported, and in situ values or in-ground values are prohibited. There's particularly additional guidance on reporting in Table 1, and particularly the introduction to Table 1. Very importantly for practitioners, the listing rules have also changed. They incorporate much of the same information, but there are parallel requirements, and in some cases they're not different, but they are supplementary to the code. So the really important thing is that you make sure that you do comply with both. There are parallel requirements. Additionally, not part of the code, given that the code deals with exploration results, mineral resources, and or reserves, production targets were not considered to be an appropriate topic within the JORC Code itself, and is covered off at the behest of ASIC now in the listing rules. So companies reporting production targets need to comply with the listing rules in that regard. Pre-feasibility study, again, to report ore reserves, and now incorporating specific requirements in terms of reporting historic or foreign estimates of resources and reserves. The additional competent person requirements, also in the listing rules, not in the JORC Code, but in the listing rules, requirements to fully disclose the terms of joint venture agreements as well. So you must make sure that you are reporting not only in compliance with the JORC Code, but the ASX rules are unique to ASX, but you have to comply with whatever exchange it is that you're reporting under. Okay, so ignorance is not a defense. You can't say that I didn't know. I certainly expect that come December this year that every report onto the ASX will be scrutinized for its compliance with the code. And obviously James Rowe will be speaking to you a bit later to let you know how they're viewing things. So in compliance with the code, and then with the rules of the relevant exchange as well. So that applies to the New Zealand exchange, for example, or any of the exchanges that are competitive to the ASX. So it's the code plus the listing rules, and then you've got public reporting that is compliant. So a few new terms in the code. Significant project has been defined, and it's defined as a project that could have a significant influence on the market value or operation of the listed entity. So there are a number of other definitions in that it does feature prominently in company announcements. The importance here is that we wanted to tighten up on the reporting of projects without capturing, say, the BHP bulletins of this world and forcing them to report specific resource data on 17 different iron deposits and producing reams and reams of data which has no benefit in terms of informing the investing public. So it's very much focused on informing the investing public, and if you're making frequent announcements about a project or it is of material value to your company, then you can assume that it is a significant project. Interestingly, the ASX listing rules talks about a material project as opposed to a significant project, but with a similar definition. Material change obviously is a change in terms of resources or reserves that could affect the classification, the valuation. If any of the assumptions have changed, then you need to report against the material change. So that's defined in clause 5. And is the project material? Well, here's a little bit of a checklist of questions. What's the market cap of the company, and would the disclosure affect the share price? Very common sense type of questions in terms of whether it's a material or significant project. Okay. Another new term, and a very, very important one in terms of the changes throughout the document, is this reporting on an if not, why not basis. The intent, of course, is to prevent misleading reports by omission. So all relevant aspects of Table 1 need to be reported against on an if not, why not basis. And if you don't think that it's significant, then the competent person needs to make comment in the announcement. There are some little additions here in terms of this Figure 1, and really the key here is just the addition of two additional terms, which are processing and infrastructure, as to whether you're going to be able to describe a resource and a reserve. And I would suggest that people with bulk commodity resources need to consider whether they've got an infrastructure solution before they really feel that they're in a position to announce reserves, for example. Explanation, additional explanation of some of the key principles of JORC have been added in terms of transparency and materiality. As Jill had alluded to, what had been seen was an over-reliance of competence and an under-reliance of transparency and materiality. So there was not sufficient information, we believe, coming to the market to allow investors or their advisors to make an informed investment decision. And so the code has been tightened up in regards to those particular areas. What you see on the slides here in terms of these square brackets and little dots are just saying that we've taken some of the more verbose elements of the code out so that it reads a little bit easier. And we've added emphasis with underlines. But portions of the code that are quoted on all of these slides, the actual code is in normal font, where we've captured some of the guidance. It's in italics, as is in the document. And each slide refers to which clause, just for your information. So Table 1 reporting, the structure remains the same. If you're reporting exploration results, for example, clearly you need to refer to Table 1, Section 2, but you also need to have commentary on Section 1. Likewise, if you're reporting on mineral resources, you need to report against Sections 1, 2, and 3. Likewise, for reserves. Okay, there's additional criteria within the table as well as guidance, so it's been expanded considerably, although the intention is not that you can read what's put on the screen. Where there's red lettering there in the screen is additions to the guidance. And then the if not, why not reporting, I think we've made that quite clear, that it's on the basis that you can't mislead by omission. Unfortunately, I think it's true to say that any code, any sort of legislation has to be drafted in the context of capturing the rogues, as opposed to the majority of people who report in the spirit of the code. So this if not, why not shows that all items have been considered where the competent person includes that the specific item is of low consequence or is yet to be addressed or resolved, and just articulates that to investors. Okay, those requirements are reinforced in each of the sections of the code that pertain to exploration results, mineral resources, and or reserves. The introduction to Table 1, as I say, has been heavily modified. This is in the context of complying with the principles of the code. Reporting on if not, why not basis refers to the exploration results, mineral resources, or reserves sections, and to ensure that it's clear to the investor whether these items have been considered. So this clause 2 of the old code, so this is not the new code. The green portion is what has been changed. It wasn't mandatory that people report against all elements of Table 1. That now has been changed, where people, some individuals were taking it as an opportunity not to report on something that was quite material. For example, if a deposit's refractory. So that has been taken out of the code in terms of whether it's mandatory or not, and it's unambiguous now that it is mandatory for you to report against all aspects of Table 1. Okay, and Clause 5, this is in context of the principles, again touching on those if not, why not things. So it's pervasive throughout the code. So you need to report against all Table 1 criteria if you're presenting new results, a new resource, a new ore reserve, or one of each that is materially changed from previously announced and properly signed off public reports. All right, I'll ask Graham Jeffress to come up and run us through the exploration target reporting. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay. There's been quite an expansion in the 2012 code covering exploration targets. It was always a somewhat vexed topic in 2004, and in response to that, the JORC committee have provided a lot more guidance now in the code as to what an exploration target is, and how you need to talk about that in a public report. It's I guess the key point there is that it's a situation where you haven't got sufficient exploration yet to have the confidence to do an inferred resource. So it's not just about what your aspirations are as a company. It's not stopping you saying our aspiration is to find an Olympic dam, but it's providing a few boundaries on how you should talk about your early stage exploration work. Clause 17 is the new clause in the code that discusses exploration targets. And I guess a key thing is that it does emphasise the importance of ensuring that the reported exploration target can't be misrepresented or misunderstood by the audience as to be at a resource level of confidence. It's also important that you need to talk about whether it's actually based on actual results or whether your exploration target is based on a proposed program. There's quite a lot more in there now, and I encourage you to go back and have a look at the code. I always carry when I've got to deal with one of these questions, the first point of reference is going back to the code. I can never remember the exact wording all the time, so I can't impress upon everyone enough the critical importance of just going back and having a look at what the JORC Code says. It's identical to the CRISCO definition now, which is an important alignment globally with what we mean when we say exploration target. As this next point should go, is talk about some of the key points with exploration targets, in that you have to talk about ranges when you're talking about exploration targets. It's a range of tonnes, it's a range of grades that you've got. Just picking a particular grade and tonnage is not appropriate. You don't have the confidence to do that, so you have to try and express it in a realistic range of targets. Just how wide that range is something that the competent person really needs to think about what's relevant. It's important to talk about how much real results it's based on. There's nothing wrong with having an exploration target based on geophysical results or alteration mapping or some other indirect evidence, but it's really important to be transparent about where your exploration target is coming from. And it's also really important to talk about everything that has been done so far. You shouldn't be selective and leave out things when you're talking about an exploration target. And of increased importance now is the fact that the cautionary statement that you need to put in a report about an exploration target, that enough work hasn't been done yet to turn it into a resource, that statement needs to be in the same paragraph, in the same place in the report where you talk about the exploration target. It can't be buried as a footnote on the last page of the report. It can't be in some teeny-weeny type somewhere else in the report. It needs to be the same place, the same paragraph that you talk about this exploration target. It needs to be absolutely crystal clear to people what this is that you're talking about, and that it's not a resource, and it's certainly not a reserve. A new requirement in the code is that you can't put these exploration targets in the headline or the highlights of your public reports, the ASX releases. It needs to be somewhere in the text. You can't hang a whole release off the fact that you've got an exploration target. You also need to talk about what you're going to do to test your exploration target. You can't just come up with some number and then not discuss how you're actually going to do some work to test your exploration target. You need to talk about when you're going to drill it, what sort of test work is required to move it along. And as with other exploration results, you need to provide enough information for people to understand it. You've got to have some maps and cross-sections, images. You need to provide some evidence about what the basis of your exploration target is. And lastly, it does need a competent person's consent for an exploration target. It's the same as any other reporting under the JORC Code. So I might move on to exploration results and what's new about them in the code as well. First thing is, it's jumped to clause 19 now rather than clause 16 and 17. This text here is new in the JORC Code, and there's also parallel text in the listing rules about the requirement to provide adequate diagrams or maps or cross-sections so that people can understand the results that you're reporting on. James will talk about this a bit later on, what the listing requirements are quite specific. The listing rules are quite specific in what they want to see. JORC Code is as you can see the words here, talking about a plan of the drill collar locations and appropriate sectional views. You can't remain silent on any issues that might be relevant for your exploration results. You've got to provide enough context. So when you're, for example, talking about rock chip results or something, you need to describe what sort of rock chip results they are. You need to say that you selectively high-graded every bit of sulphide you could find in the outcrop. Or you took a representative channel sample. There has to be enough information in the report for people to understand exploration results. Exploration results, as we all know, are probably some of the more critical step points in a project's history. You can have significant changes in the value of a company's shares based on those exploration results, particularly drilling results, and for that reason it's really important that there's appropriate transparency about what is being reported and that there's enough information provided so that the reader can understand the importance of these exploration results. Yes, as I mentioned, there's the listing rule that requests additional information about those exploration results. In fact, the listing rule requires that an appendix is provided with a table of all the drill hole information or any other relevant information about sampling. And again, it's important to do this in a context of if not, why not, under Table 1. So Section 1 and Section 2 of the Table 1 are the key things to be discussed when you're talking about exploration results. That's the other ASX requirement there, saying that they want to see all this detail about a sample, and it's no longer optional. ASX expects that all this information about your drilling is included in that first report that you put out these results. So whenever there's new results or materially changed results, you have to put in the Table 1 and you have to have all this level of information in it. That's the main new stuff in 2012. I'm sure we can discuss some of the specifics in more detail in the panel session after the afternoon tea. And at this point I'll hand over to Matt Greenwood to go through some of the changes in the resource and reserve reporting.
Okay, I'm just going to briefly go through some of the changes in mineral resources and reserves. So for reporting a significant project for the first time, where those estimates have changed significantly or materially, the following things must be included: a brief summary of the information from the relevant sections in Table 1, and also if something, a particular criteria has been omitted and isn't relevant or material, disclosure of why that is the case has to be included. So that's part of the if not, why not clauses. In addition, in clause 27, for a significant project, if a mineral resource estimate is first publicly reported, including any classification changes, or if there needs to be this transparent discussion, and that follows through the central themes of the JORC Code, and any material changes also have to be discussed. And just one other thing, these things are directly connected with the ASX listing rules that we'll be discussing after this section. Okay, for ore reserve estimation, they must be economically mineable based on measured and indicated mineral resources, and they have to include things like diluting materials or allowances for losses and anything that would cause it not to be mined. And it has to be based on a pre-feasibility study or a feasibility level study, not a scoping study, and it has to apply these modifying factors. A pre-feasibility study and feasibility study has been defined in this new JORC Code, and I'll get onto those a bit later. And that's in clause 37. Okay, the public reporting of an ore reserve estimate or a significant change, similar to the mineral resources, if they're materially changed since our last reported, or if it's the first time they're reported, a summary of the information in relevant sections of Table 1 have to be provided. A particular criterion that's not relevant or considered not relevant or material, disclosure of that, and that's again, if not, why not. For any significant project, when a ore reserve estimation is publicly reported or materially changed, and any classification changes are included in that, transparency has to be part of it. You have to have a clear discussion of why there's a new reserve estimation, so investors can understand what the changes are and why you're reporting this. Okay, part of clauses 4 and 5, there's benchmark materiality. So investor, all their advisors can reasonably expect to make a reasonable comment and have reasonable comment from the competent person on all the reported criteria. So it's all pretty straightforward, and it follows through these central themes of the JORC Code. And these sort of potential issues that impact include any limited geotechnical information, or if there's complexities in the ore body that might not be resolved, metallurgical things. Any of these things have to be reported, even if they're unresolved. If there's any doubt what should be reported, it's probably better to report it rather than not report it. So it's better to over-report than under-report. Okay, in 2002, there are actual definitions of the code, and this definitions of different study levels. So this pulls it in line with CRISCO. So scoping study is an order of magnitude study, but cannot be used for ore reserve estimation. A pre-feasibility study has looked at a range of possible studies, options for mining, and can be used for ore reserve estimation. And a feasibility study is more detailed and would have a reasonable option for mining under one type of study, one type of mining process. So for ore reserve estimation, it's only pre-feasibility and feasibility studies that are applicable. One of the other changes is annual reporting of mineral resources and ore reserves. So, although it's stated before in 2004, it's more specifically stated in the JORC 2012 code, as you can see there. Not only do you have to report annually, you have to give a date of when you have to nominate a day to review. So don't make it February 29th. You're not getting off that easy. And you must also state an effective date for your public report. In this annual review, you've obviously got to discuss any of the material changes, and previously reported on your previously reported mineral resource or reserve. So there's been a few other changes as well. One of those being a metal equivalence and in situ values. So with metal equivalence, if you're going to report a single grade for being the major metal in your mineral deposit, you have to explain all these material factors contributing to that value. You can't just give a number and not explain how you came to that number. So obviously the first one is to explain all the grades for all the metals that you've added up and put into this metal equivalent. You have to explain in some way that the assumed commodity prices rather than just giving spot values. And those prices may be commercially sensitive, so you have to perhaps explain those somehow rather than giving numeric values. You also have to put any assumed metallurgical recoveries. You can't just say it's 100% recovery. You're going to have to be realistic about this, and that can be based on actual metallurgical work or similar deposits or deposits nearby where they have got metallurgical data. And that's important for early stage exploration where you might not have a good handle on the metallurgy. So also a clear statement of what elements have been included in the metal equivalent. So you could reasonably understand how the calculation came to the number that you're presenting in your report, and also show that the actual formula that you've used. Another one is the reporting of in situ or in-ground values. Basically, there's a prohibition on publicly saying or stating there's an in situ value of so many ounces times the spot gold price or whatever the commodity may be. Because this really isn't very transparent and it's inconsistent with the requirements of the code. It doesn't take into account modifying factors, and there are better ways to value your early stage exploration or your resource than doing that. And if you do have a resource or reserve, you're going to have studies to support whatever mining is going to be required. So you'll be able to derive a proper value. And this has been based on information previously included in the ASX companies update. Okay.